for seconds. That is how long it takes for a standard-issue Mark II fragmentation grenade to detonate after the spoon releases. For seconds for the striker to ignite the fuse, for flame to eat through the delay element, for chemistry to become physics. In those 4 seconds, a 23-year-old Marine private first class named Richard Beatty Anderson performed a calculation that most human beings will never be forced to make. He stood at the lip of a 15-foot-wide shell crater on Roi Island in the Marshall Islands, watched a grenade tumble from another Marine's hand and roll to the bottom of that crater where 3 of his brothers crouched against the coral, measured the distance with his eyes, understood the geometry of fragmentation patterns in confined spaces, and subtracted himself from the equation. What follows is not a story about heroism in the way that word is usually sold. It is a story about arithmetic conducted under conditions of absolute certainty, about a choice made in the space between one breath and the next, and about the stubborn fact that some men, when presented with a math problem written in flesh and shrapnel, will solve it the only way it can be solved. The Marshall Islands in early 1944 were not the tropical paradise that peacetime tourists would later seek. They were a chain of coral atolls scattered across the Central Pacific like shrapnel from some ancient geological explosion, and by the time the 4th Marine Division arrived to take them, they had been transformed into something harder and more brutal than simple geography. The Japanese had fortified every usable inch of land, turning beaches into kill zones and treelines into labyrinths of interlocking fire. Roi Island, part of the Kwajalein Atoll, was barely large enough to appear on most maps. A splinter of coral and sand that measured roughly 1,200 yards at its longest point, but it housed an airfield that the Imperial Japanese Army would not surrender without payment in blood. The invasion began on February 1st, and within hours the island's surface had been churned into something unrecognizable. A moonscape of overlapping craters where naval bombardment and aerial strikes had rewritten the topography in explosive strokes. The Marines who came ashore that morning moved through a landscape that smelled of cordite and burning fuel, where the air itself seemed to vibrate with residual violence, and where every depression in the ground might shelter an enemy soldier or become an impromptu fighting position or, as it would turn out, a grave. Richard Anderson came to that island carrying the weight of a particular kind of American upbringing, the sort that produces men who understand work before they understand philosophy. He had been born in 1920 in Tacoma, Washington, a city that existed primarily to move timber and commerce from land to sea, where the smell of salt water mixed with sawdust and diesel and where boys learned early that survival meant showing up and doing the job without complaint. His father worked. His mother raised children in the practical manner of women who understood that sentiment was a luxury reserved for moments when the bills were paid and the house was warm, and Richard grew into young manhood with the characteristic solidity of the Pacific Northwest working class. He was not remarkable in any way that would have predicted what was coming. He graduated high school without distinguishing himself academically, worked in the timber industry doing the kind of labor that builds calluses and quiet competence, and when the war came he responded the way tens of thousands of young men responded, which is to say he enlisted. He joined the Marine Corps in 1942, passed through boot camp at San Diego where drill instructors stripped away whatever civilian softness remained and rebuilt him into something harder and more focused, and was eventually assigned to the 4th Marine Division as a mortarman. This detail matters. Mortarmen in the Pacific War were not riflemen. They did not aim by instinct or fire from the hip. They calculated. They understood trajectories and angles, charge weights, and impact patterns. They learned to visualize blast radii, to think in terms of fragmentation coverage and casualty probability. Richard Anderson spent months being trained to think about explosions in mathematical terms, to understand what happens when metal moving at supersonic speed encounters human tissue in various configurations of cover and exposure. This training was about to become relevant in a way the instructors never specifically addressed. By the time Anderson's unit landed on Roi Island on that February morning, the beach had already been taken and the real work had begun. The initial wave had punched through the coastal defenses with the kind of brutal momentum that characterized marine operations in the Pacific, but momentum on an island this small and this heavily defended does not translate to safety. It translates to a grinding advance measured in yards, a process of clearing bunkers and pillboxes and spider holes, of moving through terrain where every piece of wreckage might conceal a grenade trap or a sniper or a soldier who had decided that his death would be expensive. Anderson and his mortar squad moved inland with the advancing units, hauling the heavy base plates and tubes and ammunition that made them valuable and vulnerable in equal measure. The sound was constant. a layered symphony of small arms fire and explosions and shouted orders, and the peculiar ringing silence that fills the spaces between detonations. The heat was oppressive even in February, the sun reflecting off white coral with an intensity that made the landscape shimmer, and the smell was already beginning to turn ugly as bodies baked in the tropical air. This was modern industrial warfare compressed onto a piece of real estate barely larger than a neighborhood, and it had the character of something mechanical and unstoppable, a process that would continue until one side or the other ceased to exist as an organized force. The crater that would define the rest of Richard Anderson's life was located somewhere in the island's interior, a product of naval gunfire that had struck with enough force to excavate a depression roughly 15 feet in diameter and perhaps 6 or 7 feet deep at its center. In the chaos of combat, such craters became natural reference points, places where small units could gather for a moment of relative cover, plan their next movement, distribute ammunition, or simply breathe without being immediately visible to every enemy position within rifle range. Anderson and 3 other Marines found themselves using this particular crater sometime during the morning or early afternoon of February 1st. The exact time is not recorded because men in combat do not generally check their watches to note moments that seem routine. What is known is that the 4 men were together, that they had taken position in and around the crater, and that they had grenades. The Mark II fragmentation grenade that American forces carried into World War II was a simple and deeply unforgiving piece of technology. It consisted of a cast iron body segmented to facilitate fragmentation, packed with 2 ounces of TNT, topped with a fuse assembly that included a spring-loaded striker held in place by a safety pin and lever. The user would pull the pin, at which point only hand pressure on the lever prevented detonation, and upon release the lever would fly free, the striker would snap forward into a percussion cap, and roughly 4 seconds later the grenade would explode. That 4-second delay was long enough to throw the grenade a useful distance but short enough that enemy soldiers rarely had time to throw it back. It was also, as it turned out, long enough for certain kinds of decisions but not long enough for certain kinds of movement. What happened next is documented in official records with the dry precision characteristic of military after-action reports, but the emotional and sensory reality can only be reconstructed from the testimony of survivors and the logic of the situation itself. One of the Marines, crouched at the bottom of the crater, was holding a Mark II grenade. Accounts vary slightly on whether he was preparing to throw it or simply holding it ready, but the specific intention became irrelevant when the grenade slipped from his grip. It fell perhaps 3 or 4 feet, struck the coral bottom of the crater, and began to roll. The spoon had separated. The striker had fallen. The fuse was burning. In the sudden telescoping of time that accompanies life-threatening emergencies, several facts became instantly and simultaneously clear to everyone present. The grenade was at the bottom of a confined space. The 3 Marines in the crater had no realistic chance of climbing out and reaching safe distance in 4 seconds. The crater's walls would focus and amplify the blast rather than dissipating it. The fragmentation pattern in such confined geometry would be nearly total within the crater's volume. These facts were not subject to interpretation or hope. They were simply true, and they added up to a certainty that 3 men were about to die unless something in the equation changed. Richard Anderson was not at the bottom of the crater. He was at the rim or near it, in a position that might have offered him survival if he had dropped flat and hoped for the best. He could have thrown himself backward, rolled away, trusted distance and angle and luck to spare him from the worst of the shrapnel. He did not do this. What he did instead was watch the grenade for perhaps half a second, perform an instantaneous calculation about blast radii and body mass and the way fragmentation distributes its energy, and then launch himself forward into the crater. He did not jump toward the walls where he might have shielded one man while leaving the others exposed. He jumped directly onto the grenade, driving his body down into the coral, pressing his torso against the iron egg of the Mark II and wrapping himself around it as completely as the brief available time allowed. The other Marines saw this happen. They saw him jump, saw him land, saw him tuck himself around the device, and then they saw nothing because the grenade detonated and the world became pressure and sound and the wet slap of shrapnel hitting tissue and the immediate aftermath of silence that follows any explosion at close range. A silence not because sound has ceased but because the human ear temporarily stops functioning when overpressure collapses the normal operation of the eardrum. When vision and hearing returned to the 3 Marines in the crater, Richard Anderson was no longer a functional human being. 2 ounces of TNT detonating against an unprotected torso does not create the kind of wounds that medical training adequately prepares anyone to address. The explosive force itself is sufficient to disrupt organs through pressure alone, pulping tissue and rupturing membranes, but the fragmentation is what transforms a grenade from merely lethal to absolutely catastrophic. The cast iron body of a Mark II shatters into hundreds of irregular chunks of metal moving at velocities that turn cloth and skin and muscle into something that no longer resembles its original form. Anderson had absorbed the bulk of this violence with his own body, had positioned his mass and skeleton and the wet architecture of his internal organs between the explosion and the other 3 men, and the physics of the situation had proceeded exactly as he must have known it would. He was alive in the technical sense that his heart was beating and his brain was attempting to process input, but the damage was comprehensive and essentially irreversible. The other 3 Marines were injured, certainly, because no one survives that close to a grenade detonation without consequence, but they were injured in ways that permitted continued life. They were not missing significant portions of their torsos. They were not hemorrhaging from wounds that exposed cavities meant to remain internal. They were capable of movement and speech and would, with treatment, survive. The noise of combat provides a strange kind of cover for personal catastrophe. On an island where hundreds of men were dying across a few hundred yards of coral, one more casualty barely registered in the larger tactical picture. Anderson's squad mates and the Marines nearby did what training and human decency demanded. They called for a corpsman, that peculiar Marine Corps term for the Navy medical personnel who moved through combat zones with a dedication that bordered on suicidal, and they attempted to provide whatever immediate first aid seemed relevant, even though it must have been immediately obvious that first aid was a gesture rather than a solution. The corpsmen arrived, assessed, and made the same calculation that corpsmen across the Pacific were making dozens of times each day, which is to prioritize those who might survive over those who would not. Anderson was evacuated, pulled from the crater and moved back through the chaotic network of aid stations and collection points that constituted battlefield medical care, treated with morphine because morphine was what you gave to men whose wounds exceeded the capacity of surgery, and eventually loaded onto a transport that would take him to the USS Callaway, a transport ship that had been converted into a floating hospital for the duration of the operation. He died aboard the Callaway later that day. The exact time is recorded somewhere in naval medical logs, but the specific hour and minute are less important than the fact itself. He had survived the explosion by perhaps 6 or 8 or 10 hours, long enough for the morphine to dull some of what his body was experiencing, long enough perhaps for some final confused thoughts about home or family or the strange path that had led him from a timber town in Washington to a shell crater on an island whose name most Americans could not pronounce, and then he stopped. His heart, having circulated blood through a system that could no longer maintain pressure or deliver oxygen effectively, simply ceased its function. The corpsman would have noted the time, filled out the paperwork that transformed a living Marine into a casualty statistic, and moved on to the next patient because there were always more patients and the war did not pause for individual grief. Richard Anderson's war ended in the medical bay of a ship, not in the crater where he made his choice, but the meaningful conclusion had occurred hours earlier in those 4 seconds when he decided that 3 lives were mathematically worth more than 1. The 3 Marines who survived the crater had names and futures that Richard Anderson's sacrifice made possible. One of them was Private First Class Harry Pierce, who would live into old age and spend decades carrying the weight of having been saved by another man's body. Pierce would marry, have children, work ordinary jobs in an ordinary America that had no easy framework for processing what had happened in that crater. He would think about Anderson, speak about him when asked, try to articulate the impossible complexity of being alive because someone else had chosen death on your behalf. The debt was not one that could be repaid or even properly acknowledged. You cannot thank a dead man. You cannot explain to your children that they exist because a stranger performed subtraction on a coral island. You can only live with it, and Pierce did, carrying Anderson's name forward through time in the only way available to him, which was to remember and to testify when asked about what had happened. The other 2 Marines whose names were preserved in official records also survived, also went home, also lived lives that would not have occurred without intervention. The mathematics of the crater produced 3 survivors and 1 corpse, and whether this constituted a good trade is not a question that mathematics can answer. The United States military maintains elaborate systems for recognizing extraordinary conduct in combat, and Anderson's actions in the crater met every criterion for the highest decoration the nation awards. The Medal of Honor citation that would eventually be written, presented posthumously to his family in some formal ceremony whose specific details have been lost to time, described the events with the characteristic restraint of official military prose. It noted the grenade, the deliberate action, the ultimate sacrifice, the preservation of other lives. It used words like gallant and selfless and heroic, words that are deployed so frequently in such contexts that they have been worn smooth of meaning through repeated use. But underneath the formulaic language was the stubborn fact that Anderson had done something that most human beings, faced with the same situation, would not and perhaps could not do. The instinct for self-preservation runs deeper than training or ideology or even love, and overriding that instinct requires either a failure of imagination about one's own death or a calculation so cold and clear that imagination becomes irrelevant. Anderson had 4 seconds to imagine what it would feel like to have his body destroyed by high explosives at point-blank range, for seconds to consider the specific sensations of fragmentation tearing through tissue, for seconds to understand that he was choosing not merely death but an exceptionally violent and painful death, and he jumped anyway. Whether this was heroism or something else entirely, some psychological mechanism that permitted action before full realization could paralyze him, is unknowable. What is knowable is that he moved toward the grenade rather than away from it, and that movement contained within it the entire moral weight of the choice. The Navy, in its institutional wisdom, decided that Anderson's name should be carried forward on something larger and more permanent than documents and memory. In 1945, a destroyer escort was commissioned as the USS Richard B. Anderson, a Fletcher-class vessel that would serve through the remainder of the war and into the Cold War period beyond, steaming through oceans that Anderson himself had crossed on the way to his death. The ship was not a monument in the traditional sense. It was a working warship, a tool of national policy that happened to bear the name of a man who had removed himself from existence to preserve others. The sailors who served aboard that ship would have known the story, would have been briefed on why their vessel carried that particular name, and perhaps some of them understood the strange intimacy of serving on a ship named for a specific moment of self-annihilation. The USS Richard B. Anderson was eventually decommissioned, as all ships eventually are, but for decades it existed as a physical object moving through physical space, a steel reminder that the war in the Pacific had been won through an accumulation of individual choices, some of them calculated and final and irreversible. Roi Island was secured by the evening of February 1st. The airfield that had justified the invasion was captured, the remaining Japanese defenders were killed or contained, and the 4th Marine Division moved on to the next objective in the island-hopping campaign that would eventually terminate in Tokyo Bay. The crater where Anderson died was just one of hundreds of craters on an island that would be forgotten by everyone except the men who had fought there. The coral that had been blown apart by naval shells would slowly weather, vegetation would return, and in time the physical evidence of the battle would erode into the general landscape of the Pacific. But the event itself, the specific configuration of 1 grenade and 4 Marines and 4 seconds of fuse time, had been locked into history by the fact of Anderson's choice. Wars are composed of thousands of such moments, small tactical situations where individual decisions aggregate into strategic outcomes, but most of those moments vanish without documentation. Anderson's moment was preserved because it was witnessed, because it was clear enough in its moral geometry to be recognized as significant, and because the men who survived it felt obligated to ensure that the story was told. What remains difficult to process even decades later, even with all the comfortable distance that time provides, is the clarity of the choice. Anderson did not have the luxury of ambiguity or partial information. He did not act in confusion or hope for a miracle. He understood exactly what would happen when he jumped onto that grenade. He understood the physics, the explosive force, the fragmentation pattern, the certain result. This was not instinct overwhelming reason. This was reason arriving at a conclusion and the body obeying. There are religious frameworks that attempt to contain this kind of sacrifice, that speak of laying down one's life for one's friends, that offer the promise of eternal reward for temporary suffering. But Anderson's choice preceded and transcended any framework. It was simpler and more brutal than theology. It was arithmetic. For men, 1 grenade, unsurvivable blast radius, for seconds to act. The equation had only one solution, and Anderson solved it by removing himself from the set of living men and allowing 3 others to remain. Whether he thought about God in those 4 seconds, whether he felt fear or acceptance or the clean emptiness that sometimes accompanies actions taken at the absolute limit of human capability. No one will ever know. The interior experience died with him in the medical bay of the Callaway, and what remains is only the external fact of the action. The men who study combat for professional reasons, the tacticians and historians and psychologists who attempt to understand human behavior under extreme stress, have devoted considerable attention to acts of self-sacrifice in warfare. They have developed theories about group cohesion and training and the ways in which military culture encourages individuals to value the collective over the self. They have examined case after case of soldiers throwing themselves on grenades, charging machine gun nests, staying at their posts when retreat was available, and they have constructed elaborate explanations for why such behavior occurs. But the theories always feel insufficient when placed against specific instances. Anderson was not acting out of abstract group loyalty or cultural conditioning. He was acting in response to a specific and immediate problem that had a clear solution. The fact that the solution required his death does not make it less clear. 3 men would die if he did nothing. 3 men would live if he acted. The calculation was not complicated. What was complicated was the execution, the actual physical and psychological process of making the body move toward death instead of away from it, and on this point the theories offer little guidance. Anderson made his body move. However that worked, whatever synaptic process allowed override of self-preservation, it functioned for the necessary duration, and then it ceased to matter. Harry Pierce, in the years after the war, sometimes spoke about the weight of survival. He did not use therapeutic language or psychological terminology because that vocabulary was not readily available to men of his generation, but he communicated something essential about the experience of owing one's existence to another's annihilation. There was guilt, certainly, the survivor's guilt that plagues anyone who walks away from catastrophe while others do not, but there was also something more specific and more burdensome. Pierce knew that Anderson's death had not been accidental or incidental. It had been chosen deliberately on his behalf. Every year that Pierce lived, every milestone he reached, every ordinary moment of peace and safety, existed in a causal chain that led directly back to that crater and that choice. He could not undo it or balance it or make it mean something other than what it meant. He could only carry it forward, and he did, for decades, until his own death finally closed the loop. The other 2 survivors carried their own versions of the same weight, lived their own years purchased at Anderson's expense, and eventually died of causes that had nothing to do with grenades or combat or the Marshall Islands. They got to die old, which is what Anderson had bought for them. The question that haunts any close examination of Anderson's act is whether it should be classified as heroism or simply as the logical outcome of a certain kind of personality placed in a certain kind of situation. Heroism suggests something exceptional, a rising above normal human capacity, but Anderson's action feels less like transcendence and more like ruthless practicality. He saw the problem, calculated the solution, and implemented it without hesitation or drama. This is not to diminish what he did, but rather to suggest that the category we use to describe it may be inadequate. Perhaps what happened in that crater was not heroism in the elevated sense but something more fundamental and more disturbing, a demonstration that under the right circumstances, with the right training and the right mindset, a human being can look directly at his own imminent death and choose it anyway because the math requires it. This is not inspiration. This is not something to build mythologies around. This is something cold and clear and final, a choice made without illusion or comfort, and it suggests possibilities about human nature that are not entirely reassuring. Wars end, but the decisions made during them persist in the historical record and in the lives they shape. World War II concluded in 1945. The Marine Corps came home, parades were held, monuments were built, and the nation moved forward into peacetime with the complicated mixture of triumph and trauma characteristic of all victorious powers. Richard Anderson did not participate in any of this. He remained 23 years old forever, fixed at the moment of choice, his life truncated before it could develop the texture and complexity that comes from decades of living. He never married, never had children, never worked a civilian job or bought a house or argued politics or grew old enough to reflect on his youth. His existence was compressed into 23 years and 4 seconds, and everything that might have followed was traded for the continued existence of 3 other men. Whether this was a good trade in any meaningful sense is not a question that can be answered objectively. The three men who lived would presumably argue that yes, it was good that they survived. Their families, their children, the cascading consequences of their continued presence in the world, all of this constitutes the positive side of the ledger. But the negative side is not merely Anderson's death but all the unlived years, the unrealized potential, the family he never formed, the children who were never born, the entire branching tree of possibility that was cut off at the root. The moral calculus of such exchanges is beyond human capacity to properly compute. What can be said with certainty is that Anderson's choice represented a kind of clarity that is rare in any context and almost unimaginable in the chaos of combat. He was not confused. He was not panicking. He was not operating on instinct or training alone. He saw what needed to happen, understood what it would cost, and paid the price without negotiation or delay. There is something almost inhuman about this level of clarity, this absolute absence of self-deception or hope or denial. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding such moments, constructing elaborate psychological defenses to ensure they never have to look directly at their own mortality and make a conscious choice about it. Anderson had no such luxury. The grenade was rolling, the fuse was burning, the geometry was fixed, and the only remaining variable was his willingness to act. He acted. The rest followed with the mechanical inevitability of physics. The story of Richard B. Anderson is not unique in the annals of military history. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of similar acts occurred during World War II alone, moments when individual soldiers or Marines made the same calculation and arrived at the same conclusion. Some of these men survived, somehow, through luck or incomplete coverage by the blast or the presence of sufficient body armor or equipment to absorb the worst of the fragmentation. Most did not. Each case represents a specific configuration of circumstance and personality and training, a unique intersection of factors that produce the same outcome, and each case is worth remembering precisely because it demonstrates the outer limits of human capability under stress. But Anderson's case has a particular clarity to it, a cleanness of narrative that makes it useful for understanding what actually happens in those 4 seconds between recognition and detonation. There were no mitigating factors, no possibility of survival, no ambiguity about what he was choosing. It was death, certain and immediate, chosen deliberately to prevent other deaths. This is sacrifice reduced to its essential core, stripped of all the surrounding context and ideology that usually accumulates around such acts. On Roi Island today, if you could find the exact location of the crater, you would find nothing that speaks to what happened there. The coral has weathered, the vegetation has returned, the physical evidence has been erased by time and tropical weather. The island itself is no longer strategically significant, no longer a target or a fortress or a battlefield. It is simply geography, a piece of land in the Pacific that once hosted violence and now does not. But the event remains locked in the historical record, preserved in official documents and eyewitness testimony, and the institutional memory of the Marine Corps. Anderson's name appears on memorial walls and in unit histories and in the scattered recollections of men who served in the Pacific and knew the story. His medal sits in a museum somewhere, or perhaps in a family member's possession, a physical token of recognition that carries weight far beyond its material composition. These are the mechanisms by which individual acts are preserved and transmitted across time, transformed from immediate experience into historical fact and then into something resembling legend. But legends, by their nature, simplify and elevate. They smooth away the rough edges, the fear and pain and uncertainty, the physical reality of a body being destroyed by explosives. The actual moment in the crater was not legendary. It was brief and violent and final. Anderson's experience of those last seconds, the sensory overload and physical trauma and whatever thoughts or feelings accompanied his dissolution, was not something that can be captured in words or preserved in memory. It was private and terrible and lost the moment it occurred. What remains is only the external fact of the choice, the jump, the blast, the survival of 3 men who would otherwise have died. This is enough to work with. This is what history has to offer, the bare outline of event divorced from the interior experience. It is both more and less than the truth, simultaneously too simple to capture what actually happened and too complex to be reduced to any single interpretation. The final question that Anderson's story poses is whether such choices are still possible, whether the specific combination of training and situation and personality that produced his action could occur in contemporary contexts. Modern warfare is different in many ways from the island-hopping campaigns of World War II. It is more technological, more dispersed, less often a matter of men in craters with grenades. But the fundamental situations that require individual choice under extreme pressure have not disappeared. Soldiers still find themselves in positions where their death might preserve others, where the math is clear and the time is short and the only remaining variable is willingness. The evidence suggests that yes, such choices still occur, that the capacity for this kind of clarity under stress remains part of human nature even as the contexts shift. Whether this is reassuring or disturbing or simply a fact to be acknowledged without judgment is left to individual interpretation. What is certain is that Richard Anderson's choice in February 1944 stands as a specific instance of a general phenomenon, a data point in the ongoing human experiment with courage and sacrifice and the limits of self-preservation. When you reach the end of a story like this, there is a natural desire for resolution, for meaning, for some kind of conclusion that makes the sacrifice worthwhile or explicable or part of a larger narrative about human nobility. But Anderson's story resists this kind of packaging. It remains stubborn and irreducible, a fact that refuses to be transformed into a lesson or a moral. 3 men lived because 1 man died. The arithmetic is simple. The implications are not. Every subsequent year of Harry Pierce's life, every moment of peace and normalcy experienced by the other 2 survivors, every child and grandchild that descended from them, all of it traces back to 4 seconds in a shell crater when Richard Anderson chose subtraction over preservation. This is what happened. This is what it cost. The question of whether it was worth it is not one that can be answered from outside the moment itself, and everyone who was inside that moment and might have offered an authoritative answer is either dead or has carried the weight of it into silence. So we are left with the facts, clean and hard and final. February 1st, 1944. Roi Island. 1 grenade. For Marines, for seconds. The choice, the jump, the blast, the survival, the death. The medal, the ship, the testimony of survivors, the preservation of the story through official channels and personal memory. And somewhere beneath all of this, inaccessible to history or analysis, the private experience of a 23-year-old man in the last seconds of his life, making a choice that no one should have to make and executing it with a clarity that most of us will never be required to demonstrate. This is what Richard B. Anderson did. This is what it meant. The rest is silence, and the silence is appropriate, because there are no words adequate to the reality of such moments. There is only the fact of them, persistent and undeniable, existing in the historical record as a reminder that human beings are capable of things both terrible and transcendent, and that sometimes these things occur simultaneously, in the same action, performed by the same person, in the same 4 seconds that separate recognition from detonation. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about choice and sacrifice and the mathematics of survival, consider what it means to remember such acts. Consider sharing this story with others who might benefit from understanding what happened in that crater. Consider what you might do, faced with a similar calculation, knowing that 4 seconds is not long enough for philosophy or doubt, only for action or inaction. And consider subscribing to hear more stories like this, stories that refuse easy answers and resist comfortable conclusions, stories that insist on being told exactly as they happened, without embellishment or judgment, because the truth of what people do under extreme pressure is more compelling and more instructive than any fiction we might construct to replace it. What would you have done, given 4 seconds and perfect clarity about the cost? The question is not rhetorical. It is the question that defines the outer limit of human moral capacity, and Richard B. Anderson answered it with his body.